Okay, good afternoon. Today we have a team of presenters, and they will be presenting Building a Quality Course, Stacking in Academic Rigor, Course Level, and Alignment. Thank you.
All right, I am going to get started. My name is Rapp. I'm an instructional designer with Bellevue University, and I'm here with my colleagues today. And we're going to talk about building a quality course, how to stack in academic rigor, how to stack in course level, and how to stack in alignment. And our goal today is to talk about what rigor means in our field based on the knowledge that we've acquired by working on a long-term course review process at our university. And so I think we've already kind of given you a chance to introduce yourself. So we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm Biz Rapp. I'm a senior instructional designer at Bellevue, and Janel Heitz is our senior quality specialist within our department. And we are also joined by Dr. Katie Ostdiek, who is a fellow instructional designer. So if you haven't already, let us know what you guys do in your department. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Biz isn't actually my real name. It's Elizabeth, but I don't go by Elizabeth. I just go by Biz. So Bellevue University is a private nonprofit university. We're regionally accredited. We have over 80 degrees. We right now have over 9,000 students. We offer upwards of 2,000 master courses. Those are finished courses. And each term we run over 800 courses. Our department, design and development, our focus within our department, we're made up of IDs, quality assurance specialists, production people, and of course, operations who run all of our technical side, and along with some support groups like multimedia and also some research and development stuff that we have going on as well. But our focus within our department is to make sure that our courses and everything that we produce for our university and beyond everything that we do is well considered and well designed and well built and well reviewed. And our department sits independent from our university's 4 academic colleges. So that means that when our deans and our program directors, our faculty and our staff want to work with us, they request our services through our internal process. And our department really prides itself in consistency of product and process. And so through these big pushes of that consistency and through the creation and the iterative maintenance of our policies and our processes, along with those years of really pushing consistency and clarity and facilitation, we've really become recognized within our university for what we bring to the table for our assets and our expertise in course development and facilitation. So today, we are going to work to define what rigor means. We're going to discuss with you how we can measure it. And we're going to share our strategy for evaluating courses based on this criteria. And then we're going to discuss a bit of our experience taking the next steps into revision and leave you with some tips and pointers regarding implementation. So our objectives for the presentation are to identify the characteristics and qualities of academic rigor in online learning, to discuss how to use the QM standards to evaluate a course's rigor and alignment, ensuring both are appropriate to the course level. And we're going to examine the role of faculty and other stakeholders in building a quality course. So we just want to give you a little bit of background here. So since 2018, our design and development team, in conjunction with a few select Bellevue University faculty, we've been putting in some efforts to standardize and review and update our courses using best practices in learning design. And our work to update these courses across the university using a rubric that we designed gave us an opportunity to see a wide array of course offerings from entry level all the way up to graduate. And as we worked with our faculty and with our stakeholders, we started to have really natural conversations about topics like objectives or rubrics and about whether or not a course was challenging enough or not challenging enough, or maybe it was too tough. And these were coming up really organically, these conversations. And it became clear as we continued with this project that what we were really doing is figuring out whether or not these courses were rigorous enough. And so we determined that within our field of education, this is called academic rigor, but oftentimes within institutions it's called course leveling. So you may have heard both of these terms at various times. So we also learned that we determined how to measure and evaluate for appropriate rigor by considering and aligning the course content, course objectives, and course assessments, which we will discuss shortly. So we'd actually like to start with a little throwback to you guys. We're curious, what does your institution call this discussion around rigor? And what types of requirements and parameters do you guys have at your institutions? Feel free to raise your hands and we'll call on you or share in the chat. And if your institution doesn't have any parameters or requirements around this, how do you handle rigor where you work? We're just really curious. Is anyone raising their hand? Katie, I'm going to have to turn to you to help me moderate. Instructor discretion, yes. Oh, good. Well, hopefully some of our presentation will give you some helpful tips then if you're just looking to implement it. Oh, that's interesting. An annual summer faculty meeting for assessment. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, and we are going to talk about learning objectives because it does become tricky when there are some higher level things that you have to be careful with within your courses that might be tied to higher level objectives. So we will be discussing that too. Yes, yes, often is faculty-led instructor discretion, absolutely. Okay, I am going to continue on. Feel free to keep chatting about that, and we will return and talk a little bit more about this as well. So just so you guys know a little bit of background, prior to when we undertook this large course leveling project, our university, we were lucky enough that they had already created some parameters around what they called course leveling. And so in 2012, representatives from each of our university's 4 colleges, they co-published a document called Defining Course Levels 100 through 800 level courses. And this document includes an overview, as well as a rubric that describes student preparation at enrollment and the types of courses offered and level appropriate assessment across each of the course levels. So 100 to 400 at the undergraduate, 500 to 600 at the master's, and then 700 to 800 at the doctoral level. So the document, importantly, confirmed our university's stance on rigor. So every course must include clear level expectations along with appropriate levels of rigor and relevance. Moreover, students must be presented with curriculum that provides enduring understanding, providing transferable knowledge that will remain with them far beyond the completion of their college coursework. So to discuss this and some other tools we use to measure rigor, I'm going to turn it over to Janel.
Thanks, Biz. And as Biz mentioned, one of the tools that we'll talk about is our university leveling guide that was created, and we have provided you access to this as well. There'll be a link to a handout, and I'll share the link again when I'm done talking here. But that's one of the tools that we look to and I'll discuss. But there are 3 main things that we looked at when we wanted to start looking at how we were going to measure academic rigor. And the first one is we went to Quality Matters because this is kind of our fallback for our university when it comes to our course design standards. And the second place that we looked was Bloom's taxonomy, since it shows an increasing level of complexity from those remember and understand levels all the way up to the evaluate and create. It lends itself very nicely to this discussion of rigor and course levels. Finally, we wanted to see what our own institution already had created. So we looked at the institutional documents and policies that were already in existence, because that's a great way to build buy-in with faculty when doing a type of rigor review, if we pull from something that's already been approved by the university. And that's where we found that we have a course leveling guide that was created by a faculty team in 2012, and we were able to use that to help incorporate some of those leveling guide rubric into our own academic rigor review. So when we first talk about quality matters, there are three primary standards that Quality Matters has that relate to course level and rigor. The first one is standard 2.5, which relates to the learning objectives are suited for the level of the course. And specifically with this standard, the annotation mentions how there should be a progression to higher skill levels as the course progresses. So this means that when you have a lower level course, you're not going to just pull from those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but you might start at the lower levels of Bloom's, but then start to pull in some of those higher levels of Bloom's as the course progresses. Standard 3.4 relates to the assessments for the course and says that the assessments are sequenced, varied, and suited to the level of the course. And when in the annotation, it references standard 2.5, bringing in that alignment piece to ensure that our assessments are aligned with our objectives. And it also, the rubric makes it clear that higher level courses should include more application-based assessments. And the last standard is standard 4.1, which relates to instructional materials or course content is aligned to the learning objectives. And while it doesn't specifically discuss that the content is suited for the level of the course, it does mention in the annotation that if objectives are suited to the level of the course, then the course content aligns with those objectives, then the content should be suited to the level of the course. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying that the content is suited to the level of the course. And that's because what we found in our review, as well as what Quality Matters provides in their review, is that a full review of the content of a course is really beyond the scope of a QM review, as well as our rigor reviews. And that's because it would require the specific knowledge of a subject matter expert. Next, we took a look at the leveling guide. This was created by Bellevue University, and I think Katie has shared the document where you can find our leveling guide and take a look at it, because it's a rubric that goes through more than just what's listed here, but the areas that we looked at on this leveling guide was the course description. And what I liked is how this leveling guide defined it from 100 level courses all the way up to the 500 and 600 level courses. So at those 100 level courses, we're really looking that students are introduced to the topic, they're recalling facts. When we move to the application of knowledge, when you get to those 500-600 level courses, and that should be reflective in the course description that's created. When we talk about the objectives, we have the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy in those 100 level courses, and then we progress up to those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy in the 500 and 600 level courses. It also provided a lot of information about assessment, where at the 100 level courses, you're going to have highly structured assignments, you're going to give worksheet prompts to the students and examples, whereas when you move into those 400 or 500 level courses, you're going to be looking for more of those thesis papers, creative products at the graduate level. And the cool thing that I see with this leveling guide that our university created is it was created in 2012, which was well before we even became a part of Quality Matters, but there was quite a bit of overlap between what we saw with the Quality Matters annotation and the rubric and what we see that the faculty team had created at our university. And it really helped to guide how we could then create this rigor course rubric. So you can go ahead and switch to the next one. There we go. So when we talk about the rigor course rubric, we have 4 4 general areas, just like the QM rubric has 8 general standards. We condensed it down to 4 areas. And those 4 areas were the getting started in course design, which don't specifically relate to rigor, but are essential for a good quality course. And then we have the areas of assignment clarity and workload and leveling, which those are the 2 areas that really tie in nicely with what we're discussing and looking at with academic rigor and course level. So in our getting started section, what we really focused in at looking at was that the syllabus, what was included in the syllabus, and that there were clear directions for the students and how to get started with the course. When we looked at course design and organization, we were really evaluating how easy it was to navigate the course, that there was a consistent layout, and it was easy to submit assignments. For assignment clarity and grading, we are looking to see that the assignments had well-written instructions, they were sequenced, varied, and suited to the level of the course, supported active learning, and had clear grading criteria. And then finally, for workload and leveling, we looked at the objectives to make sure that they were suited for the level of the course. This is where we pulled from Bloom's taxonomy and saw where those verbs were coming from for the objectives. And we also wanted to look at what the number of learning activities within the course and making sure that those learning activities and assessments were suited for that level of the course. Oftentimes, we can find that sometimes faculty will start to put in a lot of resources, and we have to say, okay, are these resources really suited for or in the workload for a 100 level course versus 400 or 500 level course? All right. You can flip to the next one. There you go. Okay. So what this ultimately came down to as we were building this academic rigor rubric is that we see that there's 3 areas where we can evaluate rigor, and those are the objectives, the content, and the assessments. And so now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Katie, who's going to introduce a unique case study that of a course that went through our academic rigor review.
Remember to unmute myself. Okay, so hello everyone. So yeah, we looked at a course, we have the title up here, Global Brand Marketing 463/663. And just for some context, those numbers mean that it was both an advanced undergraduate course and a graduate course. So this is something we refer to as a cross-level course. So essentially, we have a lot of institutions may use it. It's really an enrollment kind of thing where we combine 2 levels in order to offer a specific content area to students in one term when you can't fill one. So it's kind of a necessity. I'm sure some people have experienced similar things. And so we're looking at, again, advanced undergraduate and graduate students. And our stakeholders were really program director, instructors, instructional designers, and ID directors. So we had a request to go through this process and review this course. And later in the presentation, Biz will talk about this a bit more, but it really was kind of on the cusp of some revisions within the larger program that this began. So now to kind of turn back to all of you. So I've introduced this course, right? It was a cross-level course, and we chose it because it was a decent course. And, we just want to see how we can make it better and how to ensure that it was working. So how many of you can answer this in the chat, have developed a cross-level course before? We'll start there if we have some other participants who have gone through this process. Okay, yeah. It is a very interesting process. Not that many members of our team actually work with these kinds of courses, so that's interesting to hear. Yeah, dual listed, yeah, cross listed, we also refer to it as. Okay, yeah, and if you have not experienced this, how many of you have moved content from a lower level course into an upper level course. So maybe changed the level of content, adapted a course. Okay, yeah. Maybe you had a course that had honor students in it, right? And so you have different goals or expectations for the student population for different groups of students. Okay, so yeah, we still have some people in there. So I want to bring us back to to our discussion. So we were really looking at this cross-level course in terms of these three. Okay, looking at a capstone. Yeah, the line. So right. So thinking about how these courses fit together, it's really relevant to this topic. So we were really we're discussing this case study of this cross-level course through these three blocks of rigor, right? Objectives, assessment, and content, as Janel introduced earlier. I'll turn back to Janel.
Yes. So the first area that we wanted to really key in and look at is the objectives and course level and how those mesh. And again, what we looked at in our rubric was that when it comes to those 100 and 200 levels courses, that students are primarily drawing from the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, mostly remembering, understanding, and applying. When you get to those 300-400 level, students are primarily applying, analyzing, and evaluating. And then in that graduate level, are those students primarily analyzing, evaluating, and creating.
Before I share what we found, which was very exciting, how do you create objectives for a cross-level course, or if you don't work with cross-level courses, for thinking, moving from one level to another? You can just answer in the chat. What kinds of things do you think about when you're designing objectives or reviewing objectives? Yeah, measurability, student-centered. I like that consideration of learning objectives for graduate. Yeah, it should be. Oh, are other people having trouble hearing me too? I'll try to adapt the volume. Make sure I can be a soft speaker, so I'll try to make sure I'm enunciating. Sometimes that can be an issue. Blooms, okay. Yes, I like that depth of knowledge has come up. I was seeing someone talk about that somewhere else today. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so a lot of really good ideas coming up here, different models, different frameworks. And so what we found in ours was that, first of all, the course objectives were the same for undergraduate and graduate students. That's why I was excited to see that some other institutions have already thought about that, right? Thinking about how, well, if you're expecting, you have different expectations or different prerequisites, shouldn't you have different objectives, or at least find some way to distinguish? I would say no to that, the question about higher level, but maybe we can get to that in a little bit. So like we also found that the weekly objectives used mostly remembering and understanding. And while you're going to have undergraduate courses who are achieving at a higher level, depending on the course, depending on the content and the subject matter, you also can have lower level, right? For upper level courses, lower level verbs or taxonomies, right? In terms of the taxonomy. Sorry, soft speaking coming in again. But that was mostly used throughout the course. And so that doesn't show necessarily a change in level. We also noticed that the level of objectives didn't match the course level or assessments in general. So there seemed to be some lack of alignment there. So the recommendation was really to review the objectives that were in there and see if a higher level verb might be more suited to the level of the course and might better reflect the assignment. Right, as it says in like our Bellevue guide, right, that it's okay to have some lower level objectives, especially in earlier weeks, right, or especially at the beginning of a new content area. Oh yeah, I see Maslow's brought up too. But we also want to see growth. We also want to see some change there. Turn it back to Janel.
Great, thank you. So the second area that we looked at was assessment and course level. And again, what we see mostly and what we're measuring in our rigor rubric was that at our 100 and 200 levels, we wanted to make sure that there were highly structured assignments. Prompts were provided to students. They might be given worksheets, given examples within their assessment. So there's just a little bit more guidance that's provided there for those 100 and 200 level courses. When it comes to the 300 and 400 level courses, we're looking for learner-directed assessments, student reflections, portfolio assignments, and then more application to the field. And with the graduate level, we're looking for scholarly thesis papers or some sort of creative product culminating work for their course.
So now stepping back again to our whole group, when you're creating assessments for a cross-level course, how do you go about doing that? What kinds of things are you thinking about? Like student diversity, technology. And I think it's, equity. Variety. And I like the emphasis on thinking about who your students are, thinking about the students themselves. Because we do have a community in there, right? And that's part of the course experience.
One thing I'll just quick pop in. I know earlier in the chat when we talked about objectives, there are quite a few that said they added an extra objective for the graduate level. And now we have to start thinking, well, now that you have assessments, does that mean that you have an extra assignment for your graduate level? Would that mean that you would have a different type of assignment? There's a few things to think about when you're considering the types of assessments for two different leveled students in the same course.
I love the group projects can be really interesting for cross level. Yeah, and that's something that just getting back to what we found. So when we were like reviewing this course, right, we noticed sometimes you just think, well, for higher level, you just need more, right? You just need more of this. And so like when we looked at some of the assessments, for instance, there was a brand audit assignment and it was a paper. So you can guess what the shift was. The undergraduate was one length and the graduate was a little bit longer, right? So that is definitely a temptation we see quite a bit. There were no checkpoints or opportunities for engagement, for accountability or feedback. There really seemed to be a little difference between the assignments besides just write a little more, right? Not a lot of clarity on how they're supposed to be doing something different or contributing to what's happening in the classroom, to the assessment experience. And there still would seem to be a mismatch between objectives and assessments, which you can see how the objectives, our view of objectives and our review of assessments were kind of showing some overlap. So some things we talked about were, consider having periodic checkpoints. They don't need to be graded, right? This is something, assessment does not have to be a graded assignment, right? You could have discussion boards that get students learning from each other. So, you could have a group project of cross levels. That's a great opportunity to have some students teaching other students. especially when you have students at different levels. Get them learning from each other and providing a way for more peer assistance. And consider additional ways of them being able to apply their knowledge, and rewording some of the objectives or assessments. In this instance, like rewrite discussion board questions so that we have some parallels so students know why they're doing stuff. Are they actually achieving or demonstrating, right? So those were some of the things we found with that. Did you know?
And yep, and the last area that we looked at was content and course level. And again, when it comes to content, this one can be a little bit trickier to evaluate because when we were doing these reviews, we are not subject matter experts in the field. So we had to, look at it through different ways, just like in the Quality Matters rubric, where we kind of look to see that alignment was there. And as long as alignment was there with those reading activities and learning activities, and those objectives were suited for the level of the course, then you could kind of make the assumption that the content was also suited for the level of the course. But a few things that did come up was the amount of reading that you provide your students versus what you're actually requiring for that reading activity. Are they reading because they're trying to gain knowledge of the topic, or is this a reading activity that's really leading to a skill development and some of those higher level skills? And some of that will come through with those course objectives and where you're pulling from Bloom's taxonomy and what you want students to get from those reading activities.
Okay, so we'd love to hear a little bit from all of you. And I know that especially if you're coming at this from an instructional design perspective, you may not be working with the content, but you might be consulting on how it's framed or how it's put in. This may be more, but faculty definitely are thinking about this a lot. How do you select content for a cross-level course? Is it different at all? Sequencing. Same learning content. Yeah, and as you can see, sometimes some of this discussion of content, right, is going to bleed into these other areas. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So it's hard to distinguish with the content, right? But sometimes it might even be something like a different approach, right, to content. So, I mean, what we found when we were looking at the content was it seemed to be suited to the undergraduate level based on, feedback and so forth. But because of all the other issues we identified, we concluded that it didn't seem to be at least framed. The content didn't seem suited to the graduate level, at least in terms of how it was approached and how it was used. And so we recommended, differentiating between undergraduate and graduate levels more, adding something like a peer review or self-reflection, and like we said before, periodic checkpoints. So changing how some of the students are oriented to that. And some recommendations were even to, if you're asking your students to do a more complex application of a project, then they're going to be, that's going to change what content they're being exposed to as well as they're approaching that. So so that was our recommendation with this piece. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Biz.
Okay, so we've reached the final piece, and this tends to be sort of the linchpin piece in any project of this nature, revision. And I think, as we all know, implementation of change can be really slow going in academia. So while we were able to make some changes in the course, in this course that we focused on in the case study, this cross-level course, we definitely didn't make as many changes as we wanted to. So we're always working towards a continuous improvement. And like we said, our sample course, 463 is a good course, but the revision simply makes it stronger. So a good thing to keep in mind when you do things like this is progress is progress. And so luckily, some improvements were simple enough that we could make, and the program director could easily direct that implementation of those changes. So the things that we were able to do in this course that we've been talking about, our case study course, were some assessment updates. We were able to remove an exercise from the undergraduate assessments. We improved the scaffolding for the major course assignment by introducing it earlier in the course. And then we put some considerations towards the graduate students with some increased page requirements for the major project. The other thing we were able to do were to split the syllabi so that the two different course levels had their own individual syllabi. We weren't able to change any content or any objectives at this time, unfortunately. But as you know, these widespread complex changes in our courses, they often come with sort of a host of barriers to making these changes. So our hope that, and I'll talk about some of those barriers in just a second, but our hope that is once this course is actually put into an actual review, is sent to our department, our instructional design or design and development department, for actual revisions, that we will have an instructional designer to guide some of the changes that we'd like to make. And some of those are going to include a re-examination of this course, of the course and module level objectives. So both undergraduate and graduate. So just looking at all the objectives and making sure they're all aligned. Content changes to support both the levels of the students, and then further assessment changes to make sure that both levels of students are getting captured in the learning. So some of the potential barriers that we faced, and that we might face, some barriers we faced and some that you might. One of the biggest ones we face and that we continue to face in the implementation of this process and some of these new things was managing and conceptualizing the changes to objectives and sometimes assessments based on that, because they often would have ties to larger program objectives. So be aware that work being done to course level objectives could have a wider impact. And we've talked about that. Some people mentioned some of these things in the chat, that you really can't make changes because it would have further impacts. And then additionally, some of these course level objectives are approved by special committees or bound by school regulations. So there's some barriers there to actually implementing change. And one of the things that trying to then push for that change does is not only escalates the issue, but then adds more stakeholders to the mix. So another barrier that we faced when advocating for these kinds of changes is that we needed more buy-in, basically to be able to put some of these changes into action. So to gain some of this buy-in, we made sure we fully informed our stakeholders. We shared our rubric that we were using to evaluate our courses with them. We discussed with them how we came to our conclusions and invited them to ask us questions, and met with them to go over some of the course changes that we were suggesting. And some of our stakeholders were just not ready to commit fully and jump on board. They weren't ready to put the course into a full instructional design review. The course, like we said, it's a good course. So we weren't ready to do that. They weren't ready to do that. But the work that we did actually brought to light some issues that went just beyond the course we reviewed, but some of the larger issues within the program. And the good thing about that is that we were then able to transfer some of what we had uncovered in the cross-listed case study course and some of the other courses we evaluate, and brought them into other courses to make improvements. So we realized the importance and the need for development support for our faculty and our stakeholders as we went into this project. So whether your institution would employ an instructional designer to a task like this or someone else, changes that impact course rigor can really often cover these larger issues. And calling for support from those with experience is something that might help. So an ID or a faculty member who has done this kind of work before may need to step in to help in implementing some of these changes. So as I mentioned before, oh my gosh, I am so sorry, you guys. As I mentioned before, the reviews instigated some changes, some larger changes in our project in the program, and so I happen to be one of the IDs working within this program in other ways, and some of the changes that we had talked about, I was then able to implement in other courses in the program, and I felt that was a very successful moment, I think, for all of us, to actually put some of these fully and truly into the courses. So yeah, we made significant changes in another course, and we added another course objective. We separated the syllabi, we scaffolded larger projects, and improved some of the assessments, creating more rigor for our graduates. We worked on existing assessments, and we also created some additional ones. So that was really wonderful for us. So while there were some barriers, there were also some opportunities. And so just be aware when you take on projects like this that there's the potential for barriers, but some of those lead to actually great opportunities. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm so sorry.
So you guys can feel free to unmute if you have questions, or if you want to type some questions in the chat, you're more than welcome to. One thing I saw in the chat is that someone mentioned that, they're like one cross-listed course might have an extra assignment, another one, it's the same for the graduate and undergraduate. And that's something that we're seeing at our institution as well, that there's not really a set standard on what those cross-listed courses have in them. And it really is up to the college, it's up to the faculty member developing the course.
So we got a question about how do you handle training the SME to ensure they are understanding how to build a class according to rigor? And we're very fortunate that we work in tandem with a lot of our SMEs as they're developing. So when you might have an opportunity to make a recommendation or ask a question about some of the module level objectives, and that's a wonderful partnership that the instructional designers get to be a part of. And Biz, maybe you can speak a little more to your experience working with this particular program.
Yeah. It depends how you get your SMEs, of course. So whether they're part of your university, whether they're exposed to work with you as an instructional designer. So there's a couple different pieces that might impact whether or not you can actually train your SME or if you have contact with your SME. But like Katie said, yeah, the relationship that instructional designers sort of build with their SMEs, whether they're faculty members at a university or a third party, one of the best things we do is hold kickoff meetings. So whenever we start something new with a new subject matter expert, we have a kickoff meeting, and we use that as an opportunity to set a ground, like a foundational conversation that talks about what we're looking for and asks some questions and share some expectations and transparency about what we're looking for. I always find that sharing other courses as examples, your favorite course, share it with them and show them what those learning objectives look like. And as an instructional designer, we as instructional designers we're facilitation experts. So we have all kinds of resources and all kinds of things we can share and expertise we can share, because it's really just one of those things where we just push. We're all here together doing the same thing towards the same goal. So if we have those conversations, one of the things, and this actually answers that next question, do you get pushback and how do you handle it? A lot of that is determined. Yes, we do get pushback, first of all. Yes, very much so. But honestly, when it's not, usually it's not aggressive pushback. Usually it's just like, no, we're not ready to do it. Sometimes it's aggressive, but again, reminding them that we're all here to do this together and we're all on the same page. And, as instructional designers, we're not trying to rush you. We're just here to help you and support you. And so that's really what we kind of try to do when we get pushback is to just work with the person and sort of work on their terms and try to figure out what they might need to be able to see what needs to be changed and work with them sort of in the way that they like to be worked with, honestly, and communicate the way they like to be worked with. So that's how I would handle pushback. I don't know, Janelle and Katie.
I will say that I've not related to this review, but related to QM reviews, have gotten some pushback from faculty. And what it really is they're receiving feedback, and sometimes it takes a while to digest that feedback. And what I've seen is that where they might not be receptive to feedback when they first receive it, I've seen the same course that went through an internal quality matters review a year or two later completely change, and all of the feedback that was provided was put into that course. So sometimes we have to realize that it's just about educating and providing an opportunity to expose faculty or who you're working with to some different ways of looking at how their course could be presented. And it doesn't always happen quickly.
And
with changes.
I would say patience a lot of the time. So like the empowerment question, and then we have another comment about QM. See, yes. Well, and one thing that's been helpful for us too is that it's not just us and faculty. We have our deans also approving, like faculty and instructional designers are developing standards at our institution. And so then deans have approved it. So when we go in and we ask, I usually say I ask questions because I have something to learn about what they're trying to convey in the content. And I get a lot better information from my SMEs that way, and we develop a better relationship. But also I have some of that backing of, well, this is something that your colleagues and your dean, they all are on board with. So let's try to figure out how we make your vision, your information work for the student. And if we're all focused on the student, that helps a lot. And so it is kind of empowering to have that kind of support. But the relationship is huge. We
haven't always had that kind of empowerment at our team either. For our team, this is relatively new as well. So, having the ability to really push back, we have grown our team and worked really hard to pull in people who work well with faculty and who do this kind of work well. And we have also worked as a department to advocate for ourselves and what we do. And the leaders of our department have worked pretty hard to make sure that what we do is seen and recognized. And so that has been very helpful for us. But yeah, our empowerment has only been maybe of late as we've grown as a department and been recognized more within our university.
And our session's about to end. So maybe now it's but feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions. We love talking about this.